Welcome to Chapter 8 of Understanding Human Development. We're going to talk about physical and cognitive development in middle childhood. In this lesson, we're going to cover major physical changes, we'll cover health issues, major cognitive developments. We're going to talk about the concept of intelligence. We'll talk about school success, what contributes to that. We'll differentiate between intellectual disabilities and learning disorders. And we'll differentiate between attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and autism spectrum disorder in middle childhood. What is middle childhood? Middle childhood is approximately ages 6 to 12, and it's considered the period of industry, meaning this time when kids are productive and they're contributing to their families. Of course, development is always continuous. These are not completely discrete stages as if it's a complete transformation from one to the next, but rather that they are fluid and that the change is very subtle between each stage. Of course, we're going to look at how these physical, cognitive, and psychosocial factors all interact. It's not that they change in isolation of each other, but rather that they are all contributing to, or that they all overlap in their changes. Development in middle childhood occurs in a broader social context of schools, peers, and neighborhood, much broader than early childhood, which tends to focus on the development within the family and the home. As children start to go into their school settings and they make friends, that's when you start to see a broader social context. So let's look at some of the major physical changes of middle childhood. During elementary school years, children refine their motor abilities and they become much more independent. They're able to coordinate and they're able to coordinate their movement, and so their coordination and physical abilities improve, and their social and cognitive competence also increases. So in this middle childhood, you'll start to see that physical growth is slower and steadier. So physical growth generally is gradual for boys and girls during middle childhood until they experience adolescent growth spurt. So during this time, it tends to slow down a lot, just before adolescence. The average 6-year-old weighs about 45 pounds and is 3.5 feet tall. So you can imagine once they get to adolescence, they're going to need to grow a lot faster. Now, there is wide variability in the timing of growth. On average, boys and girls are equally strong during middle childhood, but there are substantial individual differences in their body size and proportion. Now, a child's body image and self-concept may be affected by the variation in growth. So if they sprout up taller or slower compared to others, it may affect how they feel about themselves. Here are some changes that commonly occur in body size and proportion during middle childhood. As you can see, there's broad variation in growth patterns during middle childhood, and the illustrated changes here are typical. So the adolescent growth spurt will begin about age 9 for girls and about age 11 for boys. So right up until that's when the body growth or the physical growth and change is slower, up until about 9 for girls and 11 for boys. During middle childhood, children's permanent teeth will begin to come in. And so this is one of the major changes. And that's partly as this is also goes along with their bone growth. Bones grow longer during middle childhood, and they also experience a period of rapid bone growth that can produce growing pains as well. Skeleton and ligaments are not mature, and their overly stringent physical training can cause injuries. Children start, as I mentioned, they start to lose their teeth have already all grown in, so their baby teeth have all grown in, and so now they're going to start developing their permanent teeth. So all their baby teeth are going to be lost in this stage, usually around age 6. So this is one of the physical changes you'll see, that their baby teeth start to disappear. Early childhood, all the teeth came in, well, especially after infancy and toddlerhood, when they were teething and all that. So now that they had their baby teeth, now their baby teeth is disappearing in middle childhood. And that's when their permanent teeth begin to emerge shortly after the loss of baby teeth begins. So, in this middle childhood, locomotor skills are well in place by age 5 and are expanded upon during middle childhood. So, by the age of 5, like I said, locomotor skills are well in place. Locomotor simply means their ability to move around, run around, and that sort of thing. And their skills are only expanded as they get older. Studies show that boys are more athletic than girls, but that's a function more of opportunity and cultural experiences rather than biological differences. Fine motor skills also develop rapidly during middle childhood, especially if they've been practiced. Complex skills such as writing and hand-eye coordination will improve with practice. Children are able to draw increasingly complex shapes, and children in most cultures are now learning how to write. Here's a table that illustrates some of the major physical developmental changes. As you can see, between 5 and 6, they're growing in height and weight, and there's a growing awareness of the placement and actions of large body parts and increased use of all their body parts. Ages 7 to 8, they have a steady increase in height and weight as well as strength. They have increased use of all their body parts, and there's refinement and improvement of gross and fine motor skills. Between 9 and 10, again, this is going to be very varied between each person. Every child is different, so these are just norms. And also boys and girls are going to experience some differences as well. But across the board, generally, they're going to start experiencing a growth spurt for girls. And there's an increase in strength for girls coupled with loss of flexibility. So girls tend to grow stronger and higher sooner. And there's also an awareness of development of all body parts and systems, again. And again, there's ability to combine motor skills more fluidly, and they have an improved balance. By age 11, girls are actually taller and heavier than boys, usually. And this is when boys start to experience their growth spurt. And so they will start to catch up a little later. There is an accurate judgment in intercepting moving objects, so they can start to play baseball. There's a continued combination of more fluid motor skills, and they have continued improvement of fine motor skills as well. The brain continues to grow in middle childhood, and while most of the brain growth occurred in the first 6 years of life, the brain will continue to grow, of course. And brain volume will vary considerably among healthy individuals. The cerebellum will also increase in size. And also we can see the pronouncement of lateralization. Lateralization is the connections between the two hemispheres, and it's associated with specialization of certain functions to one side or the other. So lateralization becomes more pronounced. And with that, though, is the development of the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the band of connections between the two hemispheres. And there will also be development of white matter. And the white matter is what insulates the neurons, whereas gray matter reflects the lack of myelin. So white matter is associated with faster processing. Gray matter is composed mostly of the cell bodies, and gray matter forms the bulk of the brain. Gray matter will also peak in size at about age 10. Now, generally, middle childhood is one of the healthiest periods in life, and this is partly due to greater immunity and partly due to the better nutrition, health, and safety habits. So they take better care of themselves, and they don't whereas when they get to adolescence, that's when they eat more junk, they have more autonomy, so the parents can't control them as much, and adolescents are more likely to engage in risky behaviors. But during middle childhood, they tend to be the healthiest. Vision problems will also begin to emerge in middle childhood, so that's when they start to need glasses. Approximately 25% of white children, or a quarter of white children in the United States, are fitted with glasses or contacts by the 6th grade. So physical fitness or physical activity and fitness have been declining among U.S. children. But physical fitness is very important because this is this is the peak time for their health. If they're not healthy in middle childhood, that's not a good thing because it's going to set the stage for the rest of their life. There are 4 aspects that are required or that compose a good conditioning. Optimal functioning, of course, includes the heart, lungs, muscles, and the blood vessels. So, four aspects would include flexibility of the muscles, muscle endurance, muscle strength, and cardiovascular efficiency. So, there's been efforts such as the Let's Move campaign to encourage young people to become physically fit. And those are the four things that people would focus on, primarily around muscle strength and endurance and flexibility, as well as their ability to get their heart rate going, the cardiovascular efficiency. However, due to increased time that children devote to media, such as TV and video games, there's been a decline in physical fitness. More kids are sitting around and eating more, and not being outside and getting active. Nearly 19% or 18.5% of U.S. children ages 6 to 11 are considered obese, and that is measured by the body mass index, the BMI. African American and Mexican American children are especially at risk, and nearly 70% of children who are obese at these ages of 10 to 13 years of age will continue to be seriously overweight as adults. So that's why it's important for children to get in shape while they're young, because it sets the stage for the rest of their lives. And obesity, of course, as we know, is related to a heightened risk for heart disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. So that's why it's so important to ensure physical fitness while they're young. Here are some trends that you can see that obesity has really skyrocketed over the last century. It used to be that the main problem was worrying about malnutrition, especially particularly here in the United States. The main concern in the early 1900s was malnutrition. And we've gone to the other end of the spectrum. Well, now the main concern is obesity. And so you can see we've gone to the other end of the spectrum. Boys are a little more at risk, but we can see that both boys and girls today have a concern about obesity. And obesity, as we know, is measured by this, according to this chart, is measured by the body mass index, which is at or above the sex and age specific 95th percentile. So that's obesity is at or above the 95th percentile for the BMI cutoff points. So how do we assess obesity? Well, obesity is defined by the BMI, as we said. So anything between 25 to about under 30 is considered overweight. Under 25 would be normal, but below 18.5 would be underweight. But as we said, a lot of kids are now overweight and obese. So obesity is above 30 on the BMI. And again, BMI is measured by the weight and height. So let's look at the proportion of somebody's weight versus their height. So if you're tall, if you're heavy but you're tall, then that's okay, because that's supposed to be normal for the height. So therefore, BMI takes into consideration someone's height. Anything above 40 would be morbidly obese. Now, we want to be careful because some ethnicities or some body types may require a different scale of BMI. So we know some ethnicities tend to be more on the smaller side, while others tend to be on the bigger side. So obviously, we want to be sensitive to that as well. However, in general, this is a good indicator for generalizations. Obviously, everybody's different, so some people may have different bone structures. But in general, if you have a BMI over 30, that's probably not a good thing. Also, we want to consider the fact that muscles weigh heavier than fat, but in general, usually people can tell if they have that much muscle, then they will know they're pretty fit. For the most part, BMI is a pretty good indicator of obesity or not. Now, let's look at, there are some biological and environmental factors that can contribute to obesity. obviously we know today that obesity is partly genetic. It runs in families. So if you have a parent, if you have one obese parent, a child has a 40% chance of becoming obese. That probability increases to 80% if both parents are obese. Now, it's partly genetic, but it's also probably hard to know if that would be also contributed to by their social learning or the way the parents raised them. So we can look at studies that involve adopted children. So adopted children tend to more closely resemble their biological parents, even when their families try to teach them differently. So we know that there is a genetic link. Obesity is directly linked, though, to the amount and type of food that people consume. So obviously, the type of diet people eat is going to contribute to whether they are obese or not. So if you're taking the kids to the McDonald's all the time, they're probably going to end up being obese. Also, TV viewing. The amount of TV viewing is related to obesity, because if they're not active and they're just sitting down all the time, it's not going to be a good. It's not going to be a good trajectory. And parents can be encouraging. They can actually inadvertently encourage overeating. So children can learn to overeat by their parents. Family involvement is encouraged to combat child obesity. So if you think you're just going to take a hands-off approach, then that's not a good thing. As parents, we need to teach children how to be healthy and how to take care of their bodies. Let's talk about another health complication that can occur or happen to children in middle childhood, and that is asthma. Asthma is a chronic inflammatory disease, a disorder of the airways, and it's becoming increasingly widespread among children in developing countries, and it currently affects about 14% of U.S. children. It's the most prevalent chronic disease in U.S. children. That's pretty sad. Children with asthma are more likely to develop other diseases, and the percentage of children with asthma has increased from 12 to 14%. African American children are especially affected. And so it's especially prevalent among boys and among African Americans and among children living in poverty. It's more common for children in urban areas in the South and Midwest, and like I said, those from impoverished families. So there's some questions about whether indoor pollution is to blame or not. There's some research looking into that. The leading cause of death in middle childhood is accidents and their associated injuries, especially those involving motor vehicles. So they cause more child deaths than the other 6 major causes of death combined. That's really sad. And I wonder about that. Maybe it's because they're not in car seats, or young children are usually put in car seats, and maybe as they get older, they're no longer, and so they may be more vulnerable. Nearly 1/2 of all childhood deaths result from injuries and accidents. Well, it's also partly because we also know that children in the middle childhood are the most healthiest, so they're least likely going to die from natural causes. So we would know then that as a result of that most of the deaths are going to be from unnatural causes, which would make sense. And the most common unnatural cause would be accidents. Death due to accidents, thankfully, has declined dramatically over the past 30 years. And that could be due to more safety features and encouraging children to be in car seats and booster seats until they've outgrown them. During middle childhood, children's physical skills may be more advanced in their understanding of risk, which can also lead to dangerous behavior that can cause accidents as well. So we're not just talking about car accidents. It could include climbing things that up to heights that pose a risk if they fall, or getting into skating accidents and things like that, because they have advanced physical skills, but they are not necessarily comprehending their risks. They don't quite understand that they could kill themselves, and that may not hit them just yet. I had a friend when I was in 6th grade who, they were running out. They were playing chicken. They thought they could run out in front of cars and dive back onto the side of the road just before the car came, and one unfortunately ran out in front of a car and didn't make it back in time, and so he got killed. And that would be an example of how they have the physical skills to run around, they got the locomotor skills, but they don't quite understand the dangers involved, and they could get themselves killed. So another thing that will also arise during middle childhood are psychological disorders. This can begin in middle childhood, which raises concern about having accurate diagnosis and treatment. A lot of times parents are starting to discover that their children have abnormal behaviors, and they want to understand what's going on with them. So seek out professional help. And unfortunately, sometimes they get misdiagnosed because a lot of them, well, first of all, there's not a lot of research on psychological disorders tend to focus on adults. And then for children, the research is still trying to make the differentiations very more clear. Otherwise, they tend to look the same. And so ADHD sometimes or you can see all these diagnoses can look similar, if you're not quite familiar with the diagnostic criteria. There's ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, there's conduct disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and PTSD. All of them can sometimes look alike, and they can have overlapping symptoms, which can make it hard to diagnose. And all of these will affect children to varying degrees and various percentages of the population. As you can see, ADHD is 3 to 5%, autism 3 to 4%, conduct disorder is probably one of the more commonly diagnosed ones at 10%, depression 10 to 15%, which is even more common. Then there's bipolar disorder, which is 2% of the adult population, but sometimes can be diagnosed in children. This one is one that you won't see very often. And then there's schizophrenia. Again, this is going to come out it tends to come out later, more in later adolescence and young adulthood. But again, you can see 1 in 40,000 children under 12. So this is going to be, again, very rare to see in middle childhood, but it can happen. And then there's PTSD, which can vary significantly depending on how it's defined and the research. But if you look at a lot of these, they can have genetic components, especially ADHD and depression. They can have genetic components, but they can also have roots in trauma, which, children who are or young can be very susceptible to family violence and exposure to trauma, which can create the occurrence of psychological disorders. Only 1 in 5 children with a mental disorder receives treatment, which is really sad. Only 1 in 5, which is concerning because that means if they're not getting treatment, that's going to last until they're adults, and it's going to get worse. Often, parents, teachers, and healthcare providers are not aware of the symptoms with childhood onset, which can vary greatly from adult forms. So, depression in an adult may look very different from depression in a child, and all the other psychological problems as well. They can have different manifestations among children, which can make it hard for even professionals who are trained in this to diagnose. And many treatments are available, ranging from family therapy to individual counseling to drug therapies, and there are evidence-based approaches to treatments as well. So that means that if a child does have abnormal behavior, first of all, they should be diagnosed by a trained professional, someone who's very familiar with children. And then you want to get them evidence-based treatment. Evidence-based simply means that there is research that proves that it works. Otherwise, you could end up hurting a child, making their trauma worse, or delaying the treatment even more, effective treatment even more. It's important for children to get treatment before things worsen. Okay, let's talk about cognitive development. So this is not necessarily abnormal. This is just about normal developmental changes. And children will undergo dramatic transformation in their cognitive development. And it's a period of rapid development. And as we know, Jean Piaget has looked at the developmental changes between early and middle childhood and adolescence. And Piaget refers to middle childhood as the period of concrete operations. So let's look at the difference between pre-operational and concrete. Pre-operational thinking was the Piaget's stage for early childhood, whereas concrete operational thinking is associated with middle childhood. And so for Piaget, the third stage of cognitive development begins between age 5 and 7. And that's when it begins. And this is the concrete operations. And it can last until their adolescence. Children's thinking becomes more reversible, flexible, and complex at this time. The child is also able to perform mental operations such as conservation, decentration, and reversibility on objects that are concrete and that can be directly experienced. So let's look at some of the features. This is in contrast to pre-operational. They're able to reverse, whereas younger children are not able to reverse in their head things that change. Like, for example, they can now understand that something can be undone. Whereas younger children tend to focus on the here and now, and they tend to have centration, which means that they can only imagine a person as having only one dimension to them. Now, children in middle childhood now can look beyond the here and now, and they can see that things can have more than one dimension, that somebody can be an uncle and a brother and a father all at the same time, for example. And children in middle childhood tend to be less egocentric, so they're now starting to be more empathetic and thoughtful of others. And their thinking is marked by the use of logical inferences. And so there's some emergence of logic, and they are searching for cause and effect relationships. So all the important differences that are between pre-operational and concrete operations can be illustrated by the use of logical inference. As we said, that the children in concrete operations are able to begin to use some logic, and they are able to begin to understand problems involving conservation. If you recall, conservation is this idea that things can you can transfer fluids, for example, and it will still retain its volume, and that you can divide something and it will still be about the same amount. They're able to do logic using concrete objects. Here's another example of Piaget's matchstick problem. This is comparing children, like, for example, if we compare children between ages of 7 who are in pre-operational or who are coming out of pre-operational period, and children who are 12, we can see that they cannot. They're not able to differentiate they cannot do this logical problem. So, for example, if we take a look at these lines here, the top line has a series of dashes all in a straight row, and the one on the bottom are the same, also have dashes, but they're connected, not in a straight line, but they have perpendicular angles to each other. So if you ask a child which of these is longer, a younger child would assume that the line on top has more, or is longer, basically, and that has more dashes to it. When the reality is the line on the bottom, if it was straightened out, would actually be longer, and that's because it looks shorter. It looks shorter because it's all bunched up. But if you flatten it out, it would actually have more dashes. So if you count it, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the bottom, and the top is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dashes. So actually the one otherwise the dashes are the same length. So the one on the bottom is actually longer, but a young child would think the one on the bottom is shorter. And this would illustrate several principles. The principle of conservation, principles of reversibility, that sort of thing. So if they're able to reverse this in their head, they would be able to flatten it out in their mind and know that the bottom one is longer. So obviously the ones who are older, children who are older, are able to understand that problem. All right, so they haven't quite mastered abstract thoughts or relationships yet. That's why they're still in concrete operations. Children in middle childhood are in concrete operations. They're not. They haven't mastered abstract ideas yet. However, uh, they they are becoming more skilled in verbal mediation, so they're able to negotiate and talk to people, and get what they need. They can also theorize about the world around them, and they're able to start coming up with new ideas. But formal operations, they haven't quite mastered formal operations yet, which we're going to talk about. Piaget believed that children are better off when they learn at their own pace and are intrinsically motivated rather than explicitly rewarded for their success. So, are there things that or experiences that parents can do that could accelerate their children's thinking and problem solving? And first of all, we would want to think about why would we want to speed up the development of a child's thinking. Well, first of all, if they are behind, then we might want to encourage their development. On the other hand, if you're trying to get them ahead, sometimes parents want their children to be the best and the brightest. But learning environments can be structured so children can receive the prerequisite experiences that lead to more rapid cognitive advances. But again, they need to have an intrinsic motivation that will encourage them. They're better off that way. Otherwise, if you're extrinsically motivated, they may resent it and resist. So let's talk about memory and metacognition. Early in the concrete operations, children's ability to recall improves significantly. That's because, as we know, in the pre-operational period, they started to develop their memory, and that's because of their ability to have words. But now they can start to really improve their memory and work it to their advantage. They can begin to use more effective memory strategies, and they can learn to organize things in their head by categories. And that brings us to the subject of control processes. So children's memory strategies and techniques that enhance memory are called controlled processes, and these can improve with age. So some control processes that children use are things like rehearsal. Rehearsal is repeating something over and over again until they remember it. And older children will organize information into meaningful units. Organization is when they learn to associate things and use associations for relationships. They understand relationships. Whereas older children will organize things categorically, and they may use even more elaborate schemes. Semantic elaboration is when they are able to associate things verbally. Young children will recall events they experience, whereas older children are able to infer things that logically would have occurred, even if they didn't experience them directly. There is also mental imagery. So younger children can imagine events that if they receive careful instruction, whereas older children can now construct their own more vivid mental images. Again, this is all because they've developed their ability to symbolize things, and they understand concepts now. Then they also can retrieve things and remember things. Younger children can engage in simpler methods of remembering. So, for example, if you're playing memory, they might engage in simple methods, whereas older children will use flexible, creative, and efficient strategies for recall. And they also engage in scripts. Scripts are learning routines, as you may recall. Younger children will construct scripts that include events that occur routinely, whereas older children also use scripts, but they tend to be more elaborate. So scripts that children use describe a typical sequence of events that become more elaborate with age. What is metacognition? Well, metacognition is the intellectual process that enables people to monitor their own thinking and memory, and it's also known as thinking about thinking. So children become better able to monitor their thinking and memory through a process called metacognition. And again, it's known as thinking about thinking. This begins around age 6 and continues to develop through adolescence and beyond. Now, another thing that will also continue to expand is their language and literacy. Children's vocabulary continues to expand, and they have a mastery of increasingly complex grammatical structures. Whereas in early childhood, as you may recall, they tend to have rigid use of grammar rules, whereas now they start to understand that grammar is a lot more complex. They may have more sophisticated language use. They can begin to use and understand passive voice. In other words, they can say something like "I was," or something happened by. So they can use the preposition by. And schooling helps with language development, obviously. So the more they're in school, that's going to help them in the language development. And language development involves not only the transmission of words, but also the transmission of culture in both formal and informal ways. So children are going to develop more complex uses of language. And according to whole language approaches, reading and writing are literacy skills that develop from earlier language abilities, and they are influenced by children's social cultural context. So it's important for them to start in when they're young to get their vocabulary down and learn words, and then through based on the development of their literacy at an early age, they start to understand reading and writing. Reading and writing is natural outgrowth of their developing language skills. And oral and written language learning is very interconnected. So it's very important, for them to gain literacy. And there's ways we can encourage literacy. There's some conditions that will help promote their literacy. A print-rich environment. That means an environment where there's books around them and children are able to access books easily. A rich oral language environment, meaning that the parents are talking to them or their teachers or they're surrounded by refined language, and people aren't talking to them in baby language, for example. They also have first-hand experience where they're able to engage in something they're interested in. They're able to symbolically represent their experiences, and then they have pressure-free exploration with writing as well as reading, meaning they can write and read independently. And they gain information about literacy skills. So that people are educating them about how to improve their literacy. Okay, so let's talk about intelligence and intelligence testing. The first intelligence tests were, first of all, intelligence testing is a controversial subject in developmental psychology, partly because it's been misused unfortunately, it's been commonly misused. Smart kids tend to be treated differently and often have different and better opportunities in life, whereas others tend to not be given so much opportunities. And unfortunately, intelligence testing has been used to streamline people into those opportunities, whereas others are left out. But the reality is that people can improve and better themselves. And the idea of intelligence testing tends to infer that people are static and unchanging. And unfortunately, if they don't do well on a test, then they tend to be stigmatized. Intelligence test scores are often involved in public policy. The question is raised, what can teachers do to create an environment in which children of all ability levels are equally valued, where everybody's given opportunities to succeed and have fun, and not just the smart ones. Now, intelligence tests did have an important beginning. The first intelligence tests were designed to predict children's success at school, meaning they wanted to see, how would we place them? Would they be better off in some more advanced classes, or do they need to be remediated more? And so that was the purpose. And so it was relatively benign. Unfortunately, because of that, it has been used to discriminate against people. But intelligence testing has emphasize judgment, reasoning, memory, and comprehension. Those are things it tends to look at. Now, the people who started it were Alfred Binet, who started the Binet-Simon scale, and Lewis Terman, who revised a version known as Stanford-Binet. And today, the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale is one of two intelligence tests that are commonly used to measure IQ. So it goes back to Binet and the revision by Lewis Terman. And there's obviously more revised versions since the beginning. The Wechsler test includes the WPPSI, which we're going to talk about, the WISC, and the WAIS. They're all introduced. These introduced the IQ that was based on a cohort norm, meaning that the IQs were compared with children of the same age. And what is an IQ? An IQ basically stands for an intelligence quotient. Both the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler provide an intelligence quotient, or IQ, which is generally a child's mental age divided by their chronological age. So mental age, meaning their ability for their age, divided by their actual chronological age, and multiplied by 100 to eliminate the decimal point. So basically, if you think about it, it's a percentage or ratio of how one's mental age compares to their chronological age. So of course they have to have numbers that reflect a child's age accurately so that you can determine what's the IQ proportion. So an intelligence quotient would be basically a ratio comparing their mental age to their actual age. So if somebody is 120%, that means that they're ahead of their age, whereas somebody who is 90 or below would mean that they are behind their age, someone a normal, the average for that age. And older versions, so this is used commonly in determining people's IQs. So if we look at the next slide is a normal distribution of IQ scores. And the average intelligence quotient, or IQ, is 100, which makes sense because 100 is 100%. 100 reflects the normal average. So if you averaged everybody in the general population, it should come out to be about 100, because that is what the averages are based on, the normal population. So based on that Bell distribution, or the distribution curve, and anybody who understands statistics will know that generally most people will fall within one standard deviation away from the middle. Generally, about 2/3 of the population, or approximately 68%, is going to contain scores between 85 and 115. So scores between 85 and 115 represent 2/3 of the population. And almost 96% of the scores will be between 70 and 130. So if you're above 115, then that means you're above about that would be about 68th percentile. Whereas if you have a score above 130, then you would be about 96th percentile. So that'd be very high. And so you'd be in the top 4%. Whereas if you had 115 and above, then you would be approximately, that would be about, it would be above 80%, approximately, something like that. It would be minus 13. So it would be about 83% of the population if you were above 115. If you're below 85, then you would be in the bottom about 15% of the population. And so most people are and if you're below 85, then there's probably something going on there. So intelligence, this is how we understand IQs. It helps us understand where people fall in the normal distribution of intelligence. Now, deviation IQ is an approach used today that assigns an IQ score by comparing an individual's test score with the scores of other people in the same age. So obviously, we have to look at a test score And so the IQ is going to take a test score, but then it's going to compare that score with the average score for that age group, and then we can calculate someone's IQ based on their age group. And so there's going to be different scores. There's going to be different tests depending on the type of person we're looking at. So, for example, you can't give an adult and a preschooler the same kind of intelligence testing. It's just gonna, it won't make any sense. So a preschooler won't understand an adult intelligence scale, and an adult, it would be breezing through a preschool scale. So obviously they have to have different methods of measuring intelligence. So the Wechsler will have a preschool. There's a Wechsler preschool and primary scale. Then there's a Wechsler intelligence scale for children, and the Wechsler adult intelligence scale, depending on the age that you're measuring. There are 4 factors, though, that can affect the test scores. So that's why intelligence tests are not perfect. There are definitely limitations. So let's talk about the limitations. There are 5 limitations you should know. First, intelligence tests are not perfectly reliable. That means if we give somebody an intelligence test today, but then we ask them to do it again next year, they might have a different score. And that may be because if somebody they woke up on the wrong side of bed that day, or they, depending on the mood they're in, or how they're feeling, it may affect how they do on the test. So, for example, I did an IQ test and I came out really high, but I think it's because I had a lot of good sleep, and I had probably had some caffeine or something like that. Not that I recommend it, but I was wide awake when I did my test score. It was like in the morning, whereas if I did it in the afternoon after a full lunch, I probably would have a more sluggish brain, and so I think that would probably affect it as well. So environmental factors can affect your test scores, and so that's very important. And that's why it's not good to judge people based on their scores, because their family environment, their cultural, their environment that they're living in may all affect them. If they have a lot of anxiety, and some people are just not very good at tests, or they get very anxious taking tests. So the other thing is that intelligence tests do not measure every quality that contributes to or works against an individual's success, which we're going to talk about. There's other types of intelligence as well that also contribute to people's success. And tests are just one sample of behavior taken at a given point in time. It's a slice in time. It's not representative of how they're going to think under every condition in life. And lastly, intelligence tests are specific to the value of the culture in which they're developed. That's very important because, unfortunately, intelligence tests have been used to discriminate against people in the past. For example, in the early days of intelligence tests, the questions involved things that only white children were exposed to. And so, unfortunately, children of color would oftentimes come up lower on intelligence tests because they had different subculture. So Howard Gardner has introduced the idea that there are different types of intelligences. And what is intelligence anyway? Intelligence may be thought of as a composite of abilities, not just one type. The intelligence tests tend to measure a specific type of cognitive thinking ability. But there's other types of intelligence that Howard Gardner proposes. And there's 8 that he proposes specifically. The first one is linguistic. This is the sensitivity to the sounds, rhythms, and meanings of words and the function of language. Then there's logical or mathematical intelligence. This is a facility for logical and numerical operations and complex reasoning. Then there's spatial intelligence. This is the ability to perceive the visual spatial world accurately and to manipulate those perceptions. So artists, architects, they need to have this ability to visualize things spatially. So spatial intelligence. Then there's bodily kinesthetic intelligence. This is the ability to control one's body movements and to handle objects skillfully. So people who are good dancers or athletes may have this ability. So some people they have rhythm, they can dance, whereas other people don't. And so that would be a specific type of intelligence. Then there's musical intelligence. Like for some people, they can produce music and they can compose, whereas other people like myself, I can read music, but I can't compose music. That's very different. I would have very big difficulty trying to compose music. So this ability, and also the ability to produce and appreciate the characteristics of music, such as rhythm, pitch, and timbre. I would say too that I would argue that there's different types of musical intelligence as well. Some people are really good at appreciating music. Like I can actually really appreciate music. I love all kinds of music, but I'm not necessarily good at composing it. I'm not. Where some people are good composers, but they don't know how to appreciate all kinds of music like I do. You know, I love music, and yeah, and I would say there's also, we don't have on here, and I would challenge you to think about some types of intelligences that are not included in this list, because I'm sure that we can all think of some. I'll add a few in a second. But then there's interpersonal. Interpersonal is the ability to correctly interpret and appropriately respond to the moods, temperament, and motivations of other people. It's interpersonal. Some people are just really good with relationships. And then there's intrapersonal. This is the ability to correctly understand one's own feelings and moods and to appreciate one's own strengths, weaknesses, desires, and intelligences. So people with intrapersonal intelligence, they are very self-reflective. They're very in tune with their own moods and thoughts. They're able to really be thoughtful and reflective, which is really important for interpersonal. But some people are really good at caring about others, but they don't really they're not really attentive to themselves. Okay, and then Gardner would propose the naturalist intelligence. A naturalist has the ability to classify plants, animals, and features of the natural environment to make appropriate responses to each. I would argue too that we could break this up. Some people they have a good green thumb, but they don't really care about animals. So I would probably split that up between plants versus animals. Some people are really good with animals, but they don't really care about plants per se. I would also add on here cooking, taste, for example. Some people are really good with cooking. And I think that's a good form of intelligence. And then some people have a really good taste for things. They can pick out flavors that other people can't. And I'm sure you can also think about other intelligence. I would add emotional intelligence. This list doesn't include emotional intelligence, although that could probably go along with interpersonal. And then lastly, I would probably also include spiritual intelligence as well. Spiritual is the ability to look at things from a spiritual perspective. And again, some people would probably group that together with intrapersonal. Okay, so here's that same list. I could have just given it to you before, but this is a list of intelligences with each of the descriptions for them. Sternberg also proposes a triarchic theory of intelligence. And this is a theory that emphasizes the practical aspects of intelligence that are important in coping with real-world problems. So, for example, there's componential intelligence. This is skills measured by the typical IQ test, right? But then there's experiential intelligence. This is the ability to cope with new, unfamiliar tasks, which really is what intelligence should be about. Intelligence should be about how people adapt to a changing environment. And then contextual environment. This is basically the common sense ability to successfully adapt to the environment. So this is this, like what people might think of as street smarts. People are street smart, meaning that they understand the world they live in. They get the people around them. They're able to navigate the world, and they're smart. They have common sense. We all know people who they have head knowledge, meaning that they're book smart, but they're not street smart. That would be consistent with this theory. And experiential intelligence is a little different in the sense that they're able to go into new environments, but able to adapt to that environment. Okay, so obviously, as we talked about, there are some cultural issues in intelligence testing, as we alluded to before. Uh, so, depending on the demands in a person's culture, certain types of abilities may be more important or they may be less important. So that's why we want to consider people in their context. Children from economically advantaged backgrounds will score higher than children from lower class backgrounds. So is it because the children from richer families are smarter, or simply they have more resources? I like to think so. If they have more resources, they tend to be challenged more academically, and they're given more opportunities to think critically. Where certain racial groups are more likely to come from lower class families. There has been a lot of debate about, for example, some research in the past has shown that different ethnic groups have lower IQs, and that's been used to argue that they are intellectually inferior. But the reality is that it's more likely due to the socioeconomic differences between the racial groups, and that if they had come from the same socioeconomic classes, then they would come out the same on intelligence tests. That's the belief. Access to better schools has been shown to improve test scores in children who previously attended schools in impoverished areas. So it's not fair to compare children who come from different socioeconomic classes. So that leads us to the subject of socioeconomic disparity. Race is not a factor, or should not be a factor in determining intelligence, but culture likely is. Now, you may see racial differences in intelligence scores. That's why I'm bringing this out. But the reality is that it's not the race that's playing the role, it's the culture, and particularly the socioeconomic disparities. Differences in IQ scores that exist between minority and majority groups relate to the disparity in socioeconomic circumstances. And IQ differences disappear when social and economic backgrounds are accounted for. So when we control for socioeconomic differences, then those IQ differences disappear. That's very important. So although members of some U.S. minority groups typically score lower on average on traditional IQ tests than does the white majority, these lower scores are believed to result from cultural differences rather than racial differences. That's important to remember. Okay, let's talk about that. Brings us to the subject of school and learning and thinking in an academic environment. So formal schools play a crucial role in children's development. As we saw, resources contribute to differences in IQ. That would also go along with how schools play a role in their development. So children show great variation in how they adapt to the demands of school. In developed countries, virtually all children are literate. However, in the world's least developed nations, a quarter of boys and a third of girls cannot read. That's really sad. So more girls obviously are illiterate. That's because a third of girls are and a quarter of boys in developed and undeveloped countries are illiterate. So although children's opportunities to so that brings us to the subject of youth literacy. Let's take a look at this diagram that looks at the different countries and different areas around the world. So this is youth literacy rates. The percentage of the population ages 15 to 24 who can read. So this is literacy. And it varies significantly among different countries and regions of the world and between genders. So gender plays a role. That's because in many developing countries, boys are given more opportunities to have education and to learn how to read and write than girls are. So, and in developed countries, it's about the same. Most everybody is literate, but in undeveloped countries, look at the difference. Actually, if you look at how great the difference is, it's 100% in Europe, East Asia, Latin America, and I'm having a hard time. And North America, North America is not on here. but I believe it's about 100% in North America. But if you look at the rest of the world, it's down to almost just above 55% for girls in West and Central Africa. That means almost half of girls in West and Central Africa are not able to read, and that's probably because they're not given opportunities to. Okay, so as children's opportunities to attend school vary widely around the world, when children do enter, they face a variety of new expectations and adjustments. So in middle childhood, there is a greater they're expected to have a greater independence, because they're able to go to school, they're able to do things on their own, they're able to do homework on their own, and children must quickly learn to be self-sufficient. There's an adjustment to the gap between what's expected at home and what's expected at school. So they have to learn to adjust to that. And their success will depend on the family background, the school environment, and the child's own individuality. So it's a combination of the three. Their choices, but also whether the family supports him and if the school supports him as well. How well children cope with dependency, autonomy, authority, aggression, and conscience will influence their ability to adjust. Okay, so many schools emphasize rules for appropriate behavior, although children learn more when teachers spend more time on teaching and learning and less time on maintaining order. So there's discipline is very important in this time period. There's more complex social rules that they have to learn, and there's codes of behavior. One study recorded how much time teachers spent on the following activities: teaching facts, concepts, giving directions for particular lessons, stating general rules of behavior, correcting, disciplining, and praising children, miscellaneous activities. And in a 30-minute lesson, they found that a teacher may only spend 10 to 15% of time on academic work, whereas the rest of the time they spend guiding, disciplining, correcting, and that sort of thing. So a lot of time is spent on discipline and keeping children in order, which is unfortunate because the more time they spend on trying to maintain order, the less they learn. So when teachers spend more time on teaching and less time on maintaining order, the children are able to learn more. Many schools emphasize. So let's talk about developing competent learners and critical thinkers. Many educators are focusing more on helping children become self-directed, competent learners and critical thinkers. Educational psychologists recommend a range of teaching strategies, and group activities are especially effective in teaching critical thinking. So ideally, we want to teach children critical thinking. However, sometimes if you're so focused on maintaining order, then teachers may be focused on just trying to get through the day and get through the lesson rather than trying to and heighten their critical thinking. So children in poor health who are malnourished, preoccupied with problems at home, or who have low self-esteem tend to not fare well compared to those raised in healthier environments. Children's lack of scholarly self-confidence tends to predict their educational environment. So it's very important that they know that they can, it's very important for children to be in good health, to get proper food, because then they can focus on school and not have to worry about the problems at home. And when they have that confidence in themselves and self-esteem, then they tend to do well in school. And that brings us to achievement motivation. So school success is influenced by many factors, including students' achievement motivation, which is a learned drive or internalized need to persist towards success and excellence. That's achievement motivation. If they do not have all these other factors, then they're going to just not care, and they're not going to care about achieving anything, or they're not going to be very motivated. An individual's level is influenced by their culture as well as their family values. That brings us to the subject of gender differences in school success. On average, girls outperform boys in verbal skills, whereas boys do better in quantitative and spatial skills. However, this could be due to biological differences or due to gender stereotypes. For example, we do know girls' brains lateralize faster, which may have an impact on certain academic abilities. However, different social expectations for boys and girls influence their behavior. So, for example, stereotypes that boys are better than girls at math may contribute to some of these differences as well. So, while there may be some gender differences in intellectual skills, these differences are smaller now than they were 40 years ago. So, it could be due to sex differences in the brain, but gender based social expectations undoubtedly play a role. Parents can encourage their children's academic success by creating a supportive environment, stressing the importance of education, and encouraging the development of self esteem and self efficacy. Children also benefit when parents emphasize effort rather than ability as a means to academic success. So when they applaud your effort rather than your ability, then that reinforces this idea that they can. It's not about some innate intellectual ability, but rather that everybody can do it. And so if we have this idea that it's all about innate ability, then yes, gender stereotypes may play a role. Otherwise, if we believe that everybody can do it, then we can break gender stereotypes. So as I said before, math and science is traditionally defined as a male-oriented subject, whereas literature and language has typically been defined as female-oriented subjects. And teachers' expectations may influence how they teach literacy tasks, oftentimes to the detriment of boys. If they believe that boys are not going to be good at words and language, then they're not going to help boys develop their language abilities. Single-sex schools can sometimes even increase gender stereotyping. You think that it would help, but unfortunately sometimes it may even reinforce it. The quality of learning may really depend on the fit between the student and the school. So some questions that parents can ask when evaluating, parents can play a role in evaluating if there is gender bias in the classroom. For example, does a teacher call on both girls and boys equally? Do they display the work of both sexes equally, or do they just focus on the girls versus the boys? Do they offer greater assistance to girls while allowing boys to solve problems on their own? Do they punish girls and boys for the same reasons? And do girls stand back while the boys perform hands-on work in science labs? That would reinforce the stereotype that boys are into science whereas girls aren't. And are there girls only and boys only lines or teams in sports? Do girls participate in sports at recess? Are there any girls team captains? And can children of both sexes name 10 famous women in American history? In other words, do they teach about women in American history? That would be an example of gender bias. So all these things, gender bias plays a role in how our children grow up and develop and how they see their role in the world. So Carol Dweck looked at some research and on boys and girls, and boys and girls are encouraged to develop different approaches to learning. Boys adopt a learning orientation that emphasizes persistence, whereas girls are more focused on performance, which emphasizes success over persistence, which can be detrimental. In other words, if they're not successful, then they're less likely to persist, whereas boys may be taught to persist. So Dweck's views have led to more effective methods of teaching and parenting. How can parents and teachers develop a greater sense of competence in their children, if you think about it? It goes back to this idea that children can benefit when parents emphasize their effort and their persistence, again, rather than their ability or their success, rather than saying, applauding children when they did it, when they succeeded, that we applaud their resilience and their effort to succeed and to encourage them to overcome. It gives them a growth mindset that they're able to change and adapt rather than thinking that they are fixed somehow and that they can't overcome or that they're always going to be the way they are. That goes to how do we praise children? If our praise is overly critical, it's going to give them the mindset that they can't change. Praise that is directed towards effort or specific accomplishments is a valuable motivator. It creates confidence. So ideally, parents want if they want to have academically successful children, then first of all, you need to be realistic about this child's abilities and interests. Don't be overly critical if they're not, if they're not achieving for their where they should be. And yet, we want to be firm yet flexible. And ideally, warm communication is key. Examples of effective and ineffective praise include things like, "You are so intelligent. I'm impressed with the quality of work you're able to do." Well, that could be effective. The problem is that "you are so intelligent" is a static quality, and again, you're impressed with I'm impressed with the quality of work you're able to do. That makes it sound like it's is um, a one-time thing that they're not able to change. And so intelligence, it kind of reinforces this idea that it's a static quality. Let's look at B. You really studied for your social studies test. You read the materials over several times, outlined it, and tested yourself on it. It really worked. That would be effective because you're being specific, and yet at the same time you're emphasizing the effort. You're helping them link exactly what they did to their outcomes. Let's look at C. You have a real artistic talent. I think you're the most creative child in your class, and you have a bright future as an artist. Well, that would be good. Only problem is that is first of all, it's emphasizing a static quality. What if they're not able to always keep up with that? That would be one of the challenges. It's also somewhat, we don't know if they are the most creative child in the class. And maybe if it's true, it kind of reinforces this idea that others are not, and it also puts it links their success in life to this identity. And then what if they don't want to be an artist? Maybe that's not their strength. So they have to be reminded that their success in life is not necessarily always tied to what they are able to do. This last one says, "Just try your best, and if the work is too hard, we'll figure out something else you can do." I like this. I mean, this is reminding that kids, should do their best, and if they're not successful, then we'll find something that they are good at, which is okay. And maybe you might think of a better way to be more motivating, but I like this last one. It's just allowing a kid to be a kid and is not tying their value as a person to their success. Sometimes children are not able to keep up with other children their age intellectually, and so that leads us to the subject of intellectual and developmental disabilities on 8.6. Now, opportunities available to all children with intellectual or developmental disabilities and other special needs were radically expanded with the enactment of PL 94-142 in 1975. And this was originally called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Then there was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. But the current revision of this law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. This law requires that all children with special needs be afforded educational opportunities in the least restrictive environment. So individual education plans, or IEPs, must be prepared by educators for each child who is diagnosed with special needs. As a result of PL 94-142, students with special needs are less likely to be placed in special settings. They're more likely to be integrated with other children. So, what are intellectual disabilities? Intellectual disabilities, formerly called mental retardation, are characterized by significant limitations in both sub-average intellectual functioning and adaptive self-help behavioral skills. So they have limited self-help skills. And this has an onset before the age of 18 years of age. This affects between 2 to 3% of the population. It's usually first noticed in early childhood. So usually parents will notice this early on. But this can be caused by several hundred possible causes. But and those causes can be biological, environmentally induced, or result of physical trauma. So the most common causes are Down syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or Fragile X syndrome. So there are individuals are sometimes categorized by the severity of their impairment. So first of all, usually intellectual disability is diagnosis with somebody who has around or below 80 on the standardized IQ test. So if you remember the IQ test, and if you remember that bell curve, 70 would be on the far left, on the bottom range, and and so 70 would be about 70 percentile of, or it would be well below. It's not 70 percentile, but it would be 70% of the score basically, and so compared to somebody of their age basically. So this would look at scores on tests of adaptive behavior, looking at conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. And clinical assessment will also consider cultural factors. This will look at community environment that's typical for the individual's peers and culture. We'll look at the linguistic diversity of the culture, as well as the cultural differences in the way the individual communicates, moves, and behaves. You don't want to assume that somebody is intellectually disabled when it could just be a result of their community environment. So individuals are sometimes categorized, like I said, by the severity of the impairment. And so it's below 70, but it can range from mild to profound. So mild is anywhere between 55 to 70, and that would be about 85th percentage of the total group. And usually these people require, and this is 85%. 85% of people who have an intellectual disability. 85% have mild levels, and these people only require intermittent levels of support, meaning occasional. Now, people who have an IQ between 40 to 55 have a moderate level of intellectual disability, and these compose 10% of those who have intellectual disabilities, and they require limited level of support. A severe level of intellectual disability is an IQ between 25 and 40, and this is about 3 to 4% of people with intellectual disabilities, and they require extensive amounts of support. And lastly, profound are people who have an IQ below 25, and this is between 1 and 2%. 1 and 2% of people with intellectual disabilities, and they require a pervasive amount of support. So that's profound. And as I said before, usually parents have an idea early on whether their child is going to have some kind of intellectual disability. Now, how is that different from a learning disorder? Learning disorders are not intellectual disabilities. These people would otherwise have normal intelligence, but they just happen to have challenges in specific areas of learning. So disorders that are associated with difficulty in acquiring some specific academic skills, but not others, despite normal intelligence in the absence of sensory or motor disabilities. They may occur in areas such as reading, writing, or math. So this is not somebody who has, this is somebody who can have a normal intelligence, but for whatever reason they have difficulties in sensory or motor disabilities. They don't have sensory or motor disabilities, but they may have challenges in reading, writing, or math. And these people may have average or above average general intellectual ability. Like for myself, I can speak for myself. I don't know if I've ever been diagnosed as having a reading disability necessarily, but I know that I have taken reading tests, and I come up really low. I'm a really slow reader. It takes me a long time to read things. But otherwise, my intelligence is up to par. It's not, on the upper side necessarily. So it's not correlated. You can have a learning challenge and still be intelligent. Up to 80% of children with learning disorders are boys. So there could be a biological reason for this, maybe due to lateralization or something else. But so there is a relationship to sex or gender in this. Typically, like I said, learning disorders will fit into three main categories. Reading disorders, which include dyslexia, so people may read things backward, and so that would be a reading disorder. And then there's or not necessarily backward, but they may just confuse letters. Then there is writing, the writing disorder or disorder of written expression. And then there's mathematics disorder. People just have difficulty with math for whatever reason. Okay, what is dyslexia? I mentioned that before. Dyslexia involves incorrectly perceiving letters and words. Children with dyslexia often have broader language-based problems. It's generally understood to be a disorder involving how basic speech sounds are processed in the language system in the brain. And it's maybe an underactivation of the neural networks for reading, and there may be genetic processes involved or epigenetic processes. So as I mentioned, I was a slow reader. I know one of my siblings was dyslexic, and my son, he's a little slower in his speech, and we're still trying to help him develop. I mean, he's getting there, but he is definitely on the slow side, learning to talk. And there could be a biological basis for that. So let's talk about helping children with learning disorders. Children with learning disorders may become isolated from their peers, and they may experience isolation at home. So especially if they have to be in different classes. That's why now we try to keep people in classes with their peers. They may also experience isolation because they require more help. Treatment involves intensive remedial work. And having a learning disability should not be associated with failure. It just means that they have some challenges. The earlier the intervention, the better a child's chances are for later success. And so because it's part of their long-term development. If we can catch it early on, then it can help them rise above that and adapt earlier. Okay, another challenge that children are being diagnosed with today is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a disorder that involves symptoms of extreme inattentiveness, problems with impulse control, and high levels of activity. They're very hyperactive. Although some children may present only symptoms of attention deficit and others experience only hyperactivity. Usually both are in evidence. Now, when I was growing up, we used to call it ADD or ADHD. It used to be two separate diagnoses. One was ADD, meaning it was focused on the attention deficit, and the other one was ADHD with the hyperactivity component, when the emphasis was on being hyperactive. Now we've just combined them into AD/HD. So in other words, it's part of the same diagnosis rather than two different ones. So you won't see ADD anymore like we used to have when I was a kid. And so ADHD may result from different causes, both genetic and environmental. I think the reason why they lumped them together is that the distinction between the two wasn't really held up by the empirical evidence. While some may manifest it differently, the reasons for it and the causes are still just being explored. There's lots of different theories for what causes it. And then so the other thing, let's talk about something else. Oh, and many children. And then another thing which we're going to talk about is this autism spectrum disorder. This is not the same thing, although people may think they're related. This is a group of related disorders of varying levels of severity that begin in early childhood and involve disturbances in social interaction, communication, and behavior. That's autism spectrum disorder. So we're going to compare them. ADHD is defined, as I said, by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And those are the three main things that are required. How do we treat it? Now, many children respond positively to stimulants. They are typically amphetamine-type drugs, and like Ritalin. That was one of the popular ones when I was younger. And some other methods are behavioral methods, and this would include consistency management, also known as applied behavioral analysis. Also, educational management restructures the child's environment by simplifying it. So helping them through their education, making it simple for them to be able to focus. Treatments or programs that are applied consistently have the best results, and usually early intervention is important. So just the key here is that it's a combination usually between medication and behavioral skills training. But it's also important not to just to make sure that it's not misdiagnosed. Sometimes people are misdiagnosed when it's not necessarily ADHD. It could be depression or childhood PTSD or something else. Okay, then there's autism. Autism spectrum disorder is a category of developmental brain disorders. And this can have symptoms that can range from very mild to very severe. It's a wide range of symptoms. And the hallmark symptoms involve disturbances in social interaction noticed early on in infancy. And communication skills may be absent or distorted. Imaginative play is limited, and repetitive behavior is often present. So, for example, one of the things I was told is that kids with autism might be really fascinated by their sensory input. And for example, they might want to play with the light switch a little too often and repeatedly. Another thing that's also been theorized to be related is perhaps there is a inability to develop their mirror neurons, which are important for empathy, but it's also important in modeling behavior from our social interactions. And so that's theorized to be related. So symptoms typically associated with autism spectrum disorder are impairments in social interactions, such as not smiling, poor eye contact, not responding when addressed by name, and impairments in nonverbal gestures. Communication is impaired. They are not babbling or pointing by age 1. They may not have single words by 16 months and no 2-word phrases by the age of 2, so they have delays in speech. They also have impairments in the ability to imitate or sustain a conversation. And they also may have stereotyped or repetitive use of language. And then another thing that's interesting is their behavior. Like they might have excessive lining up of toys or objects. They might have inflexibility to adjust to new routines. And so all these are symptoms of potential autism. So today is estimated that about 1 in 68 children in the U.S. will have some form of autism spectrum disorder by the age of 8. And the cause of autism is unclear, but genes play a role. And autism seems to be run in families. Boys are 4 to 5 times more likely than girls to be diagnosed. So again, there could be some gender or sex linked to this disorder. It's thought to result from various problems associated with the brain. Again, early intervention is key to help children developing. Let me just review with you just to make sure. Just to recap, autism spectrum disorder is more common among boys than girls, and at present there is no known cure for autism spectrum disorder. So let's just recap. We've talked about physical growth in middle childhood. This is gradual until adolescence when there's a growth spurt. Lateralization, which is the communication between the two hemispheres of the brain, and this is when it's most pronounced. This is most pronounced during this time, and that could be seen in specialization of the hemispheres. Then there is gross and fine motor skills that continue to develop. And then, as we said, this is the healthiest period in an individual's life. Physical activity and fitness, while it's the healthiest period, physical activity and fitness is declining among U.S. children. We've also talked about how obesity is increasing, and 19% of school-age children are obese. It's measured by the BMI, which is their body mass index. We've also talked about how asthma is becoming increasingly widespread, and it's common among developing countries, and it may be related to poor indoor air quality. Accidents are the leading cause of death in middle childhood, and that's because children are healthier, so they're less likely to die due to natural causes, and also because their locomotor skills are more advanced, and yet they are unaware of the risks and dangers that are inherent in certain activities. This is also a time when psychological disorders and mental illness can begin to be seen. And then we've also looked at the cognitive development. So according to Piaget, this is the concrete operational period. This is when they're able to can do some logical reasoning, but generally around concrete objects and not abstract ideas. So they are able to engage in conservation or think about conservation and reversibility. So the thinking becomes more reversible, flexible, and complex. They're able to use control processes which help them to remember things and to memorize things. Children's memory continues to improve with their age, and vocabulary expands in middle childhood. Again, reading and writing skills develop from earlier, based on their earlier language abilities. We've also talked about individual differences in intelligence. We've talked about the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale and the Wechsler test. These tests give you an intelligence quotient, which is the understanding the age of comprehension, basically what level they would test at compared to their actual age, and so it would be divided by their testing age divided by their actual age, and that would give you their intelligence quotient. So a high IQ above 100 would say that they're advanced for their age, whereas lower than 100 would say they're behind for their age. And a deviation IQ is simply just that comparison of their test score with their age cohort. Test scores, of course, are not a perfect measurement. We looked at limitations of that. There's all kinds of environmental factors that can contribute to test scores being low, and there's also the unreliability of them as well. Children also learn more when their teachers focus on teaching and learning. We've talked about how when there's problems in the social environment, such as teachers having to deal with children who are acting out or not motivated for school, that can also impair the educational environment, and which could also which could pull down their development. Small group projects and activities tend to promote development of problem-solving skills and enhances their self-esteem. We've also talked about achievement motivation. This is basically children's motivation to achieve. If they don't have a supportive environment and they don't have the belief in themselves, they may not care to excel. Parents can encourage their success with a supportive environment, stressing the importance of education and encouraging the development of self-esteem and self-efficacy. And we talked about how criticism can play a role. We also talked about emphasizing their effort rather than their abilities. Intellectual and developmental disabilities have to do with their a biological cause that prevents people from being able to keep up with their with peers or age, basically. So that would be intellectual or developmental disability, and it also impairs their ability to care for themselves as well. And so we want opportunities to be available to all children. So that's why even children with disabilities are included with other children so that they're not left out. Intellectual and developmental disabilities are characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive self-help behavior. We talked about learning disabilities, and those are usually classified as either reading, writing, or math disabilities. And dyslexia is basically the inability to, or the struggle to sometimes read or see letters in the right pattern. So they might confuse letters or read them backward. And then we also talked about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder, ADHD or ASD. ADHD is characterized by extreme inattentiveness, problems with impulse control, and high levels of activity. And both of these can be due to genetic, well, ADHD is especially caused by genetic and environmental causes. ASD, I believe, there is no cure, and so there's also no clear understanding of what causes it. We have some theories, but both of these are biological in nature, at least. And many children with ADHD respond to stimulant drugs, but those who do not respond positively, environmental modification can be an effective treatment. So both can be important lines of working with people. Autism spectrum disorder involves a significant impairment in social interaction, communication, and behavior. So think about this. This is very different from ADHD. ADHD is about the ability to focus and control oneself and not to be hyperactive. Whereas autism is more about social interaction. People with ADHD may be very social. In fact, they may be very, and actually both may be very smart. But people with ADHD can be very social, whereas people on the autism spectrum, they have impairments in social interaction and communication and behavior. And symptoms of this tend to appear before age 3. Whereas people with ADHD, it may not appear until they're in their middle childhood. The number of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder is increasing, and as I said, presently there's no cure for ASD. And that's all.